Hello there, friends. Welcome back. A few years ago, I did a video about a children's book. It was the book I probably spent the most time looking at when I was a kid. And it's possible that the book we're going to look at today, this one, came in at number 2 because I did spend an awful lot of time with this book as well. It's called We Came in Peace, the story of man in space. This book was targeted at probably the middle school, high school audience. And it was published in September of 1969. Only a couple of months after Apollo 11 landed 2 men on the moon for the first time. So this was at a time when public interest was at its peak for manned spaceflight topics. This was at a time when businesses and retailers all wanted some sort of a commemorative item to sell or to offer as a premium gift with a big purchase or something like that. And this book is no exception. If we take a look at the back, we see the Gulf Oil logo on the back. This book was published to be offered in the Gulf service stations across the country. Perhaps it was a giveaway item if you bought a certain amount of gas, or just an additional thing you could buy there. But leafing through this book really fired a lot of imagination in me when I was a kid. And so I thought it would be fun to flip through the pages with you here in this video. We could point out the various infographics. There's a lot of infographics in this book. And read the captions on the various photographs and paintings. And then I might close the video with a non-speaking flip through again of the book, just for the page turning sounds. So we can see on the cover a painting of who we presume is Neil Armstrong stepping off of the lunar module landing pad for the first time. This book is filled with paintings in this style, which are fairly evocative on their own. Also, fair warning, this book is in pretty poor shape in terms of its binding and the spine. It's it's pretty well falling apart, so don't be alarmed when you see that damage. I suppose it's a sign of how well read it was back in the day. I warned you. Here we have a photograph of one of the Apollo missions and the Saturn V on the pad, nearly in silhouette. And a quote from John F. Kennedy here. We came in peace. The dedication reads, "To those men and women who have given so much of their talent that man may walk among the stars." This book is filled with photographs and paintings and infographics, as well as several larger articles that contain most of the technical information. You can see them arranged in the table of contents there. And there's an introduction, which is an excerpt from George Muller, who is the NASA Associate Administrator for manned spaceflight, in a statement to Congress that he made in March of that year, 1969. The now of space. Liftoff. can we take a moment and admire this fantastic circular geometric typeface that they created for this book. It was called Galaxia at the time. And there's a collection of photographs of various rockets lifting off, lots of flame, lots of upward movement. It's so funny to look back at a book like this and pictures like these with an adult's eye now and wonder things that I'm sure never crossed my mind as a kid. I love how inconsistent the labeling on the pictures are. This picture here is of one of the Apollo launches, but it's captioned as Saturn V, which was the launch vehicle, not the mission, whereas this Gemini 7 picture lists the mission and not the vehicle. And then we have a Nimbus, and Tyros, and Syncom. These other pictures are of weather and telecommunications satellites. And as an adult, I can't help but wonder why there's not a picture of Mercury on these pages. It's a stepping stone that ought to be included here, I would think, in a book about man in space. Oh well. It was still very evocative as a kid because there was very much a sense of going someplace, from these pictures. Aboard the space capsule, we have some captions here. Schweikart's Apollo 9 spacewalk. That's going to be Rusty Schweikart was his name. And Scott in hatch of Apollo 9 command module. They're talking about Dave Scott there. The spacecraft cockpit is tight quarters, they say. And I believe that. If you've ever seen a Apollo command module in person in a museum or someplace, it is fairly tight. The view from space. This caption reads, "Our planet Earth is a beautiful sight to astronauts with blue and white surface of ocean and clouds. It seems to be lonely and far away. More than one astronaut has spoken spoken after the fact about how seeing the Earth in its entirety at a distance had a pretty dramatic effect on their worldview and their notion of humans' place in the universe. View of the moon from Apollo 8. That was the first mission to go out to the moon itself and orbit. Lunar surface is marked by craters. There's Baja California, the water between Ethiopia and Arabia. Man in Space. Edward H. White takes a spectacular walk in space from Gemini 4 flight. Umbilical cord connects to spacecraft. Ed White. This is one of the most famous early manned spaceflight pictures, I've always felt. Ed White perished in the Apollo 1 fire, of course. Docking maneuvers of Gemini 7. Side view of Agena. Agena was the unmanned vehicle that they used for docking practice on the Gemini program. Floating free in space, a spent rocket, it says. Space hardware. Look at all of these various satellites. Pioneer 8. Lunar orbiter. The lunar orbiter was kind of a big deal because these are the missions that mapped, or photographed rather, the lunar surface when they were, as a precursor to the Apollo missions. This information was used to select landing site candidates for Apollo. There's quite a lot going on in these satellites for their time. They had to take pictures on film, process the film, scan the film, and broadcast the data back to Earth. All in a chunk of hardware orbiting the moon in the 1960s. Pretty impressive, if you ask me. Relay 23, Tyros 7, Syncom, Mariner E, one of the Venus probes there. Application Technology Satellite. The Lunar Module. Telstar. It's fun to do Google searches or look at Wikipedia articles for these old satellite missions. A ton of this hardware is still orbiting the Earth to this day. Moonship One. This is one of the ultimate infographics, in my opinion. Look at all of this. Photograph of the Saturn V on the left, and then a cutaway infographic of the launch vehicle and the Apollo payload at the top, and all of this great technical information. I just ate this stuff up when I was a kid. We have 3 stages, of course: first, second, third. Instrument unit here in between. And then all of the Apollo spacecraft up here at the top, along with an escape tower. All of this hardware, all of this weight, and only this little cone-shaped command module makes it back to Earth at the very end of the mission. Isn't that something? 7.7 million pounds of thrust coming from the first stage of the Saturn V. More fantastic infographics. Here's that first stage we were just talking about, Saturn V. It's got 5 of these F1 engines down here at the bottom. And the J2 engines in a comparison to the height of a man. J2 were used on the other 2 stages. It's a little graphic on thrust. Little graphic on the function of the engines themselves, how they combine the various elements to produce thrust. We have a graphic on the combustion process. It's quite a lot of detail for a commemorative book targeted at kids, I always thought. And here is the anatomy of the Apollo spaceship. The 3 primary sections: command module, service module, and the lunar module. as well as the apparatus that was attached to the launch escape system. And then here are the breakouts of the three modules. Command module here with the three astronauts. It even has a cross-section, typical cross-section of crew compartment, heat shield, and inner structure. Again, a lot of detail. The service module, and the lunar module, including both the descent stage and the ascent stage. This poor thing. It has definitely seen better days. The spacesuit. Development of Apollo spacesuits. This is a section of the book called Mission Profile, and it includes a breakdown of the anatomy of a typical Apollo mission, all of the various steps and stages that were required to get to the moon and back. It starts with this little graphic about how you've got the Earth in the middle and the moon around the outside. It has little lines showing the initial parking orbit and then the translunar injection that gets out to the moon, orbiting. It's showing, though, that the moon is moving this entire time in its orbit, and how that initial translunar coast out to the orbit of the moon isn't actually heading toward the moon. It's heading toward the spot where the moon will be when you get there. You kind of meet at a point in space. You're actually traveling to a spot ahead of the moon, which is a very big brain thing to think about. Orbital mechanics and all of that. So step one is launch. We see another Saturn V here. Step two is the Earth parking orbit. Step three is the translunar injection. This is the third stage burn that kicks the vehicle out of Earth orbit. Step four is the lunar module transfer and docking. This is where they extract the lunar module and dock the command module such that the configuration is like this for the trip to the moon. There's also some mid-course corrections that they, if needed. Step 5 is the lunar orbit insertion. That's the burn that puts them into orbit. Lunar module and command service module orbit Moon together. Then lunar module descends to surface and leaves the command and service module in orbit. Step 6 is the lunar module descent. Lunar module commander flies unit to touchdown. We have a graphic here of all of the candidate sites that were considered for Apollo 11. Site 2 over here was the one they finally decided on. Step 7, the lunar stay. I love this painting. This is the relatively short stay on the surface where they leave the lunar module a couple of times to gather samples and take pictures and what have you. Step 8 is the lunar launch. This is another one of my favorite paintings. I was always taken with the notion that you would leave this hardware behind. It was always interesting to me to think that there were all these descent stages laying around on the moon, and that were still up there as I was reading this book as a kid. This painting shows extravehicular activity between the LEM and the command module. It says, astronauts walk between the lunar module and command module if mission dictates. I'm not an expert on all the mission details. I'm not sure how often or if ever they had to do that. Step 9 is the trans-Earth injection. This is the burn that knocks them out of lunar orbit and heads them back towards home. Command module heads for home by firing rocket engine on moon far side. Step 10 was entry. This is the very dramatic part at the end where the heat shield is put to use to protect the astronauts. On re-entry, command module separates from service module and turns blunt heat shield toward atmosphere. And step 11 is recovery. The recovery in the ocean. For all mankind. If anybody is watching season 7 of The 100 on the CW, you've been hearing this phrase a lot, but for different reasons. The 100 fans out there will know what I'm talking about. Here we have Edward Aldrin, Lunar Module Pilot. That's Buzz Aldrin. Neil Armstrong, Commander. Michael Collins, Command Module Pilot. And we have here a few excerpts of the actual communications, transcripts of the communication between the Eagle and Mission Control at Houston. So, if you consider that this book came out in September, this would have been one of the last sections that could have been added to the book, because this information didn't exist before July 20th of that year. We see Neil Armstrong's famous quote down here: Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. And then, of course, the even more famous quote here. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. We see that this section includes photographs from that mission versus the paintings that were used to describe the mission components earlier. This section is called Magnificent Desolation, which was one of Buzz Aldrin's famous quotes from the mission. And that little communication excerpt is included here. One of the many views of Earth from the surface. Yes, this is history, it says. And here is a third communication excerpt that includes the phone call from President Richard Nixon here. And more photos from the mission. And then this great painting. I still remember being taken with the the loneliness of this painting. Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind. This section of the book is called Ground Support, and it goes into quite a bit of detail about the support from the ground that was key to pulling off a mission like Apollo, and the particular emphasis is on the communication network that had to be in place for all of this to work. This caption says, "Like something straight from Buck Rogers, ground support tracking equipment gives scientists and engineers precise information on spacecraft." Every time I turned to this page when I was a kid, my eyes went right here. This is the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. This is the place I always wanted to be. I thought it would be cool to be one of these guys. I never was, but some people might have wanted to be an astronaut when they read this book as a kid, but I wanted to be one of these guys. I always had a behind the scenes kind of outlook on things, and this was always the most appealing to me. Behind the scenes, helping things go smoothly or trying to solve problems. That was where I wanted to be. It's a tracking telescope used during launch. Tracking ship Mercury used for Apollo. A technician tracks Apollo. Mars antenna at huge Goldstone site. And Apollo spacecraft during ocean recovery. And this wonderful graphic along the bottom, which I believe mirrors this tracking map that they had at Mission Control. Tracks the very beginning and the very end parts of the mission that are close to Earth. The yellow lines indicate the outbound sections of the mission, and the blue are inbound, and the various tracking stations that they had to switch between in order to provide continuous contact as the Earth rotated are all depicted on this map. said, this was a fairly detailed article about that communication network. Now, this was a favorite section for me, even though in retrospect I can see that this was somewhat of a filler section just to make the book a little bit thicker. There's not really a reason to include a section on the solar system in a book about manned spaceflight, but I was glad they did, because this was a fun section for me. This fun, colorful graphic of the solar system here, including our boy Pluto out there at the edge. Shows the distances of the orbits of the planets from the sun. This is not to scale, though. We have more killer infographics about the Milky Way, our location in the galaxy. One for the asteroids. This graphic, this table here at the top that's just titled Some Planetary Data. Good job. Relative size of the planets. The piece of this graphic that always got to me, of course, was the edge of the sun and how big the sun must be for this curvature here. Apparent sizes of our planetary neighbors as seen from Earth, and a graphic about comets. Nice large graphic on the sun here. With a cutaway view and some data. Again, anything that showed the relative size between the Earth and the sun, I was all about it. I imagine how screwed we'd be if one of these solar prominences engulfed the Earth. That's what I thought about when I was a kid. The texture. All that texture that was never apparent from the ground on Earth. Sunspots. So here we have a very interesting graphic that covers the planets. And you'll see a big difference between 4 of these pictures and the other 4 of the pictures. Yes, Earth is not included here. See that the pictures for Venus, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars are these fuzzy, well, they're photographs. These 4 images come from telescopes because we didn't have nice detailed photographs from orbiters or flyby missions at that time. We actually might have had. I should have looked that up beforehand, when the first Venus and Mars probes were. But if we did have good pictures of Venus and Mars in 1969, they chose not to use them for this book. But then the other 4, Mercury, Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto, well, these clearly aren't photographs, and they clearly aren't the result of flyby missions, because those were many years away. These are artist doodles, essentially. For the 4 planets. You know, the fact that we had telescopic photographs of 4 planets in this book, but then artist renderings of the other 4 was that was another thing that really kind of fired my brain up back in those days as a kid, because I was very curious about what these planets would eventually be revealed to look like. We eventually found out, of course. And they were all pretty amazing. And then, of course, we have to have some information on the moon, since this book is about man in space and the attempts to get to the moon. We talk about phases of the moon here, general moon data. We also have some infographics on the Earth's atmosphere, the troposphere, stratosphere, mesosphere, ionosphere, and exosphere. The Earth does get a mention as well. This article is called Your Future in Space. And again, this is targeted to kids that are still in middle school and high school, and it's all about essentially drumming up excitement about possibly, targeting your efforts to try to get into a space career when you got out of college. Qualified is the word to remember when you plan to seek a space-age career. It means that you should start studying hard now. You should determine to make high marks in college. Boys and girls who barely get by in their schoolwork will have little chance to find important jobs in the space program. The thing that's interesting, though, about this article and some others in the book that talk about that make speculative or forward-looking statements, is how much optimism there is in some of these statements, and how little of that actually came to pass. Here in this first paragraph, when you finish college, many thousands of qualified young men and women will be needed. By that time, the United States should have a large space station circling in orbit far above the Earth. As many as 100 people may be living in the station, carrying out scientific work. At the same time, the United States will probably have built a scientific station on the moon. Even more exciting, it is likely that astronauts in much larger spaceships than we have at present will be training to go millions of miles from Earth to Mars and Venus. Plans will be underway to reach even more distant planets in our solar system. And I think this kind of optimism can be forgiven when you consider that it was written right after Apollo 11, when the hype for these endeavors was at its peak. This was before public interest began to wane as the follow-on missions occurred, and as the costs of these programs began to be questioned. But as we now know, we were not able to maintain the kind of momentum that would have been needed for any of these statements to have been true at the time they were predicting them to be true. But this was all about getting people excited about getting into space. filling out salaries. In $1969. I also love how everything is built around, in terms of getting more information. Everything is about libraries and writing letters to NASA to get more information. It says how you should read some of the books about space that you will find either in your school library or the public library. Hundreds of them have been published at the readership levels of young people like you. Another good way to keep up with what is happening and is planned in the space program is to ask your science teacher to write to NASA requesting that your class be put on the free distribution list to receive NASA facts. This publication is especially written for students in junior high and senior high schools. It is illustrated and makes fascinating reading. I wonder if NASA still publishes anything that is targeted to high schools. Perhaps it's a website now. And the book closes with a final section, a brief history of space exploration, particularly focused on rocketry and the advancements in rocketry. Robert H. Goddard, American rocket pioneer. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky. There's a crater on the moon named after Tsiolkovsky. Gerhard Zucker with German mail rocket of 1930s. War rockets and fireworks skyrockets of 17th century. Wernher von Braun, of course. And a final collection of references here at the very end, where to ask for NASA services for the public. Breaks down the country by states and tells you where to write for more information. When writing, please start the address with the topic in which you are interested, such as things like space mobiles, TV and radio, speakers. You could write to have an astronaut, one of the astronaut pool that perhaps were in training for future missions to come to speak at your school. For further reading, this is an interesting one here. Again, I'm not sure why they decided to include some of this information for this target audience, but this is a little panel called Who Makes the Moonship? And it's a listing of all the contractors, all the companies that were involved in making the various pieces. From the lunar module to the engines, all the way down to the spacesuits and the huge crawler that they use at the Cape to get the Saturn V from the vehicle assembly building out to the pad, and everything in between. I have a glossary here of space terms and a listing of space organizations. I guess they wanted to give the young reader every resource they could to write for more information if they were inspired by anything in this book. It's almost like a recruitment tool for NASA, in a sense. The final panel mirrors the first panel with a quote from Nixon. That is a flip through of this book that inspired me so much when I was a kid. Did you have a book like this? I don't mean necessarily about space. I mean, did you have any book that you just couldn't get enough of when you were a kid? You just devoured it. It took you to a different place, or it made you imagine possibilities for yourself and your future that might have seemed unattainable at the time, but gave you inspiration to try to reach for. I hope so. I think those kinds of things are really important for the young mind. As I said, I'm going to close this video with another slow flip through of the book with no talking, so that we can just hear the paper sounds. So I will bid you farewell now, with my hope that you enjoyed this video. I'm looking forward to seeing you next time.